Oh, the wonders of Zoom with all these meetings. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Allan Kelly. Yeah, I like to think that I make modern, usually digital work less chaotic, more predictable, and that means more sustainable and more effective. It usually involves the word agile. The tools I use, kind of agile tools and OKRs, if you heard me before, I'll mention them a little bit in this presentation. And in between times, I write books, I run workshops. I'll give you an advert for some of them later on. I've worked with so many companies, most of whom you've never heard of. I've worked with some big names like Virgin Atlantic Airways and Reuters and the Bank of England, but most of the companies I've worked with are too small for you to have heard of. So that's me in a nutshell. Enough for the admin. Let's go on. Now, I have some questions for you. So it's audience participation time. But actually, what we were just doing on the Miro board prepared us for this. I want to ask you, do you have a backlog? So on Zoom, you know the hands up feature. Can you go and find the Zoom hands up feature and put your hand up on Zoom if you have a backlog? I know some of you might be working Kanban style and don't have a backlog. Some of you may have got something better than that. So let's get a feel. Okay, most of the hands are going up here. Oh no, somebody's thumbs down. Good. Okay. So can you take your hand down if and only if your backlog is going to be done in the next quarter, the next 3 months, the next 12 weeks? So leave your hand up if your backlog is going to take you longer to do than that. Yeah, most of the hands that went up are still up. In fact, maybe one or two more. Okay, so can you take your hands down if your backlog will be done in the next year? If you're fairly confident it will get done in the next year. Okay, a few more hands going down. Okay, this is looking good. There's a okay, so still a fair few people who can see their backlog will last a year. And I wonder if I was to ask you, is your backlog, doing the backlog, a sign of success? And I think quite often that is the measure of success. Whether a team is successful or not depends on whether the backlog is done. And people talk about, when will the backlog be done? When will it be done? And what they're actually saying is, when will you reduce the backlog to zero? So for better or worse, our backlog has become one of our success indicators. And I'm not sure doing all the backlog really is a sign of success. Do you remember at the start of the pandemic when you went into your supermarkets and you found they'd sold out of things like pasta and toilet roll and things? This was not good. You know, backlogs are what give us work. Backlogs will allow us to generate value and deliver benefits. If we run our backlog, we can't deliver goodness to our customers. So I'm not sure we do want to do all the backlog. But let me ask you this. Does your backlog look like backlog A, or does it look like backlog B? Maybe you could type in the chat window, A or B. Which one looks closest to your backlog? The gently declining backlog that we see in all the textbooks, or the more erratic, sloping upward backlog? Okay, somebody must say A here. Everyone's going. Somebody. Oh, there we go. Thank you, David. Okay, we got an A. A. Okay, maybe A. B. Yeah. Yeah, so most of our backlogs slope upwards, which really we should accept that, but it's often seen as a sign of failure. It's seen as a problem. It's difficult. It raises questions, and people aren't happy with it. When it comes to doing the backlog, unfortunately, we live in the world of should, and as is so often the case with the word should, you know, we should stop global warming. We should feed the world. We should create world peace, and we should do everything in the backlog. That's what the textbooks say. And some of our electronic tracking tools conveniently draw a 45-degree angle on our charts, as if that's the line of perfection. That's the line of beauty they're all aiming for. As with so many other things, the road to hell is paved with good intention. Yes, we should do the backlog. We should do all of these things. But the fact is that it's unlikely to actually happen. More often you find yourself in this situation. You're there as a product owner, or you're observing your product owner, and someone comes along and they say, hey, I've got a great idea for a feature. There's something I really need your product to do. And the product owner notes it down, writes a ticket out and says, thank you for your idea. I've added them to the backlog. Now your stakeholder, your customer, your user is thinking, great, he's taken in my item. I wonder how long it'll be before I see it. And the product owner is actually thinking, he'll be lucky. You know, we've got 100, 200, 1,000 items in our backlog. This one he's just given me isn't going to get to the top anytime soon. And so we just silently accept it, because the cost of adding a backlog item is almost nothing. What does it cost to write out a card, to open Jira, to type something in? But the cost of saying no, the cost of saying to somebody, that's a really good idea, but I don't think it fits our product, or I don't think it's going to make it in the prioritization. You know, every chance the person who's asking is going to be upset by that. They're going to ask why, they're going to query you. And instead of it being a 5-minute conversation, you're going to be standing there for an hour. And if they're still not happy, they're going to escalate it. They're going to go to their boss is going to go to your boss. It's going to go up. And before you know where it is, the cost of saying, no, we will not take that into the backlog, is hours and hours and thousands. So what happens? We take these items in, we put them in the backlog, and 6 months later, our customer comes along and says, oh, how are you doing with that backlog item I asked for? And the product owner says, oh, I'm awfully sorry. We haven't forgotten it. It's there, you know, other priorities got in the way. And under the hood, what's not being said is the product owner is thinking, you know, this item hasn't made it to the top in 6 months. The chances are it's never going to get to the top. And our customer's thinking, I'm losing trust in these guys. Because if we silently let backlog items sit there in the backlog, if they silently age and we don't go and tell people the honest truth, which is your item is highly unlikely, possibly will never be done, then they're not going to like that. It's going to be difficult for us, but it's dishonest not to say that to them. It's dishonest if we don't tell them that an item that's been in the backlog for 6 months is really unlikely to get done. So those marooned backlog items that are in there, but you know, they're going to get forgotten about. They're not going to get prioritized. They erode trust in our teams. And remember, Agile principles were supposed to be about trust and honesty. And yeah, it's just not honest to tell someone that an item is in the backlog and to know that it isn't going to get done. So we're going to create difficulties for ourselves in future. The fact is that our problem is not having ideas for backlog items. We think of greater ideas for our backlog all the time. Our problem is delivering on those items, delivering the backlog. And this problem that comes after that is meeting expectations. Just an item being in the backlog, it leads people to think it's going to get done. And that is not the case. An item in the backlog is not a promise. It's not a commitment. It's nothing more than a good idea. So backlogs simply don't scale. You know, in the small, for a sprint, for the next sprint, for a few weeks into the future, backlogs are fine. But when you're measuring your backlog in terms of hundreds of items, when you're measuring your backlog in years, that's not scaling. And trying to get two teams with large backlogs to coordinate their actions by agreeing which backlog items to do, you know, they've both got hundreds of items. That is a really difficult task. So backlogs are good in the small, but when you try and scale the idea up, it really doesn't work. And that shouldn't be surprising, because what do we want in our backlogs? We want small stories, and the smaller the story, the better. We want small work items that can deliver benefit. We're actively striving to have small things in the backlog. So, to scale, we end up with hundreds or thousands of these things, and it's a coordination problem. So we shouldn't be surprised that it doesn't scale. Backlogs work well in the small, but not in the longer term. So we end up with a situation where you can't see the wood for the trees. We can see our backlog. We can count dozens, if not hundreds of items, but we lose the overall vision. We lose the vision of where the product is going, what the organization is trying to do, our real purpose, because our world revolves around the backlog. It's backlog-driven development. We're constantly trying to do more backlog items, get our backlog velocity up. So let me ask you another question. So if you can, pop your answer in the meeting chat here. Who knows your team's velocity, whether that's in story points or backlog items done or something? Yeah, and if you can, tell me what your velocity is, but just, do you have a number? Can you tell me what your team's velocity is? You just type into the chat there. Let's see. 15, excellent. Yes. 20, yes, yes. 50, yeah, 50 is really good. 30, yes, yeah. Okay. A lot of you've got an idea. I love the approximate, by the way, every approximate. Okay, so a fair few of you know your team's velocity, right? But can you tell me, how fast is your backlog growing? How many new items do you put in the backlog each month? As a percentage of your backlog, how much do you add? Anyone know? Perhaps no, thank you, Steph. No, 10% good. A lot. Okay. So a few years ago, I was working with an airline, and they wanted to do the backlog. They thought the backlog had everything, and their velocity was, I can't remember what it was, 70, 80 story points a month, something like that. And I sat down and I looked at the backlog and I analyzed it one day, and I discovered the backlog was growing faster than we were doing it. I think they were doing like 7% of the month, 7% of the backlog each month, but the backlog was growing at about 7.5% a month. So this was like having a mortgage where the payments you're making are not even paying off the interest you incur each month. The backlog was growing faster than they were doing anything. So the idea that it would be done, it's just never going to get there. And occasionally the more senior manager would sit down and he'd just cross out large sections of the backlog, but those sections of the backlog had a habit of regrowing. The people who had their subsystem taken out, they go and find another pot of money to fund another backlog for their thing. So it was a persistent problem. So if you're going to measure your team's velocity, you really need to measure your growth rate as well. One without the other is meaningless. And I think many of you will find the backlog has become a bottomless pit. Personally, I blame electronic tracking tools. In the days when I was a product owner, product manager, the backlog was a whole bunch of cards that sat on my desk just under the monitor, and I could physically look at it and I could see how big the backlog is. Now, you put these things into your electronic tracking tool, 2 items, 20 items, 200, they take up the same space. You lose conception here, and in Jira, no one can hear you scream. Our electronic tools suck it all up. So our backlogs are just bottomless. And then you start to add new techniques like dual track Agile or discovery as you go along. And this completely invalidates your backlog. If dual track and discovery encourage you to find more work to do, they encourage you to test with your customers, consult with your customers, and use that as feedback to generate more items. So if you've got a backlog of 100 items and you're doing dual track and you're doing discovery, your backlog's always going to be growing. So how can we possibly measure done as doing all the backlog, because you're actively seeking out more. And the problem also occurs when we get into techniques like OKRs. And I've come across teams who add OKRs. They're doing everything else. They're doing the backlog. They're working hard, and they're just asked to do OKRs in addition to everything else, which is like saying, well, here's some more work to do, and you aren't given 8 hours more time to work on it. You don't get 8 hours extra in the day. You just have more work to do with increased WIP. So if you're going to work with OKRs or a similar objective setting technique, I think you really have to think about which comes first. Do you set OKRs to reflect the backlog you need to do? Or do you build a backlog from the OKRs you're set? If you're trying to do both OKRs and backlogs, you're building up the condition for conflict. Are you successful because you do a backlog, because you do 60 backlog items? Or are you successful because you achieve some OKRs? And if they're not saying the same thing, you're going to fail on one of those. But if they're going to say the same thing, you have to decide one comes first and one comes second. So I'm talking about OKRs because, you know, that's something I've written a book on, but, you know, it could be other objective setting techniques. You see the same thing with sprint goals. Do you set a sprint goal based on the backlog you decided to do? Or do you set a sprint backlog, set a sprint goal and then choose backlog items to match it? I think it should be the latter, but most of the teams I've ever seen who use a sprint goal choose a set of backlog items, and then they try and craft the sprint goal to go with the backlog items they decided to do, which I think is the wrong way around, but I'll let you be the judge of that. So let me give you a thought experiment. What if you go into the office tomorrow, or you log onto your system tomorrow, you sit in your own office and log onto issue tracker, and you find your backlog is gone. You find that somebody threw the physical backlog in the recycling bin and it's been chewed up now. Or you find that the system was hacked and your backlog was deleted. Okay? What would you do if tomorrow morning you'd lost your backlog? Let's have some suggestions. Type them into the chat window. Yeah, we'd all give thanks. We'd open a bottle of champagne and we'd give thanks. Okay, so after we get over the celebration, what do we do? Because if we don't do backlog, we don't get paid. No work, no eat. So what are you going to do after you celebrated, when you sober up? Work as always. Have a time. You have a time. Ask the customer again, right? Re-enter the important items, right? If you think about it, if tomorrow morning there's no backlog there, the chances are you remember the important things. You remember the thing you were working on today. You know, it's like when you leave home, and you know, it's something we do a lot less than we did 3 years ago, but when you leave home, do you carry a piece of paper with your name and address on it in case you get lost? Because really you should have your name and address on it in case you forget where you live, shouldn't you? Most of us kind of remember where we live, and the same is true of the really important things you need to do, those burning backlog items, the things you're being pushed for. Unfortunately, also the things people are shouting for loudest, but you kind of remember the important things, and you also remember who you need to talk to. You remember who asked for things, or at least the important things. And even if you don't remember who asked for it, you kind of know who to go into. Who's going to use this? Do we need to talk to an external customer or an internal user? And you wouldn't be lost. You would quickly find work to do if you had no backlog. And maybe over time you would slowly rebuild your backlog, but you do that by going out and talking to people. And the people you talk to, they would remember the things that were important to them. They would remember the things they've been asking for because they have to do it every day. And they would forget the things they'd asked for 6 months ago because it was a great idea, but frankly, they haven't noticed it since. So, yeah, so losing your backlog could be an advantage. It could be a good thing. You certainly wouldn't be stuck. It's very unlikely that you're going to lose your backlog and someone's going to come over and say, right, backlog is now 0. We can fire you. Perhaps in the current climate, I shouldn't make that joke. So what I want to suggest is perhaps you should nuke your backlog. Perhaps you should intentionally throw your backlog away. Perhaps you should live in the moment. Forget about your backlog. Forget about the bear down shots. Go and revisit the people who are important to you. Go and revisit your customers. Go and talk about what's really wanted. And they may sound crazy, but we can find examples of this. Life without a product backlog. There is one company, and maybe some of you work here, and maybe you're going to tell me you do have backlog, but I hope you recognize what I'm going to say. There's one company that has a process in place that actively supports this. They're called Amazon. And Jeff Bezos has long pushed this philosophy, which he calls day one. And he says, at Amazon, I want everyone to feel as if they are working in day one of a startup company. Now, I'm sure he doesn't mean day one in terms of the bank account being empty. What he means is you should always be thinking about what your customers want and what will add value for your customers. Because at day one of a startup, the thing you need is happy customers who are giving you money. And if you lose sight of what your customers or users, if you're internal, want, then you've got problems. And I'm sure many of you have seen projects where all they're doing is doing backlog items and they've really lost track of where the customers are. So what Jeff Bezos is saying is always be challenging yourself. Ask yourself, is what we are doing, is what we are working on something our customers want, something that adds value to our customers, something that's going to cause our customers to visit the website, to buy a book from us, to sign up for Prime? Always be revisiting that question. And I don't think day one means that you forget the past. Because I think if every day you went into the office and you said, it's day one of the startup, I must go out and survey my customers, you probably wouldn't get much else done. I think you're allowed to say, look, we have the information we had yesterday. We have the survey we did yesterday. We have the systems we built yesterday. We have the pizzas we bought yesterday. Whatever it was you've been doing, you have that information. Periodically, you want to refresh it and check it's still valid. But if you've been building a system for the last 3 months, you don't start building another system today. You keep on progressing it. But what you don't do is say, I've been building this system for the last 3 months. I have now discovered that our competitor has launched this product before we have. We need to keep on building it for another couple of months, and our competitor is eating our lunch. If the competitors launch before us, perhaps it doesn't make sense to keep doing what we're doing. At least go and revalidate it. And quite possibly, just because you've been doing this for 3 months, just because you spent €1 million on this, it doesn't mean you should keep on doing it. So we don't keep doing things just because we've done them, just because they're in the backlog. We're happy to revisit that question. So I think if you lost your backlog, it would be like day one. You'd be starting up. You'd be asking yourself what the customers want. So if you think, every organization, every company exists for a purpose, what I sometimes call a level 1 goal. Your organization exists to benefit society. Yes, I know some of you are thinking all my company cares about is money, money, money. The bad news is that companies like that aren't as successful as companies that have purpose and motivate their staff and really work to be a benefit to the world. Companies exist for a purpose. And within that purpose, you may have missions, or level 2 goals, I sometimes call them. And a company may have one mission. It may be a small company, maybe a startup, and you've got one mission, and it's your purpose. Or in a larger company, you may have multiple missions. And within those missions, you may find teams. Now, purpose tends to have longevity. Purpose lasts a long time. Missions come and go, but missions generally last months, if not years and decades. And what we're saying is, on a regular basis, and let's say quarterly, because that's what a lot of our methods are based around, On a regular basis, we take that context, our mission, our purpose, and we set some level 3 goals. Every 3 months, we're prepared to throw away the backlog. We're prepared to revisit our mission, revisit our purpose, put our day one hats on, revalidate everything, and decide our desired outcome, our goal, our product goals, our OKRs, or whatever mechanism you want to use. On a regular basis, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, whatever it works for you, stop, reset that goal, and don't become beholden to the backlog. Let the backlog fade away or throw it away completely. And so what you're doing is you're going to replace your backlog with a just-in-time story generator. So whatever mechanism you're using to set the context, whether it's purpose, mission, day one, OKRs, product goals, job to be done, funnel, there's plenty of these ideas out there. These things power a story generator. And every time you go into a planning meeting, or every time you go into a replenishment meeting, every time you need to ask the question, what is the next thing to do? You power up your story generator, you revisit your product goals, your true north, your jobs to be done, and you generate the stories you need to do to move yourself forward on that. We still have a small backlog. It may only last a sprint, it may only last a few weeks, but we'll get away from these big backlogs with hundreds or thousands of items where we are lost in a backlog. We're going to step back, look at our objectives, our goals, and drive ourselves from those objectives. We're going to think wide at the beginning, we'll go narrow to execute, then think wide at the end. So most of our times in the middle there, we're executing against our goals. We're saying, here's our goal, what do we need to do next? What do we need to do next? And you're revisiting that. At the beginning, you think expansively. You say, okay, we're setting our goals for the next 4 months. What are our goals? Where are we going? What do we need to do? You then, once you've set it, you then go narrow, you execute for a few weeks. And then at the end, you think wide again. You go back and say, ooh, have the things we have done in the last 10 weeks, the last 16 weeks, have they moved us towards our goal? Have they made the world a better place? And we think broadly when we think about the benefits we've delivered. We measure our progress and we pat ourselves on the back, we hold a retrospective, and then we loop back to our wide, expansive thinking. We say, okay, what goals have we got for the coming period? Some of the goals may follow naturally on, some might be quite different, but we keep going to our goals. We need to go narrow to execute, but then we go wide at the end to evaluate. So, you know, we can have our usual sprint cycles, but we lay a super cycle over it. And every time we go into the sprint planning meeting, we power up the story generator and we generate the stories to move us forward against our goal. So it just looks like a giant sprint. Yeah. And maybe in the first half, the product owner is doing more consultation with the customers and then consultation with key stakeholders, so that when you come to the end and you're closing out and preparing for the next super cycle, you've got that information. And this also helps focus the product owners. Or your business analysts or product managers, whoever's doing it, that they know in the first half of the cycle, they need to be, you know, getting out, visiting customers, listening to them. And later on in the cycle, they need to be thinking about the next set of goals you're going to pursue after this. So your sprints look much as they ever did, but you've got this story generator down there. You're going into your planning meetings with a just-in-time story generator. You don't carry in a backlog, you carry in your story generator. And those goals are driving your planning. Every planning meeting, you are asking, will this advance us against our goals? Are these items needed? Or, you know, can we leave it? You know, it's like, we don't just do stories because they're in the backlog. We do stories because they will advance us on our goals, and we don't want to get distracted by them. So, one more thing here. We need to think about time. And we need to go back really to an old Agile concept of time boxing and say, we've got the time we've got. The whole debate over estimation, whether to estimate or not, misses the point that if we're working in time boxes, at the end of the time box, at the end of the time period, we have something that improves the state of the world. We may not have done everything we could do. We may not have the perfect product, but we should not be saying, how long will it take to build something? We should be saying, what can we do in the time we have with this goal? What can we do in the next week? What can we do in the next sprint? What can we do in the next quarter? You know, we are accepting that we can't do everything. We can't do the perfect product. But what we can do within our time box is something. It's like you're building a railway. You're not going to build the best railway in the world. You don't set out just to build the best railway. You are building the best railway you can within the constraints, over the terrain you need to run, with the funding you have, with the team you have. And that's what we should be doing here. We are saying we have a goal for the next 3-4 months. We know the time, we know the direction, right? What can we do to advance ourselves on this? What can we do so that at the end of this period, we have realized some of that goal, or we're close to that goal, or we have delivered a small thing which satisfies the goal, and we can get the feedback and we can loop around if necessary. So we need to revisit the idea of time boxing and think, what can we do in the time we have to advance on this goal? So I want you to lead with goals. Yes, I'm going to suggest you use OKRs for goals. I think there's some merit to them, but frankly, I don't care what goal setting mechanism you use. We just need to set some goals, and our goals should clearly follow our organizational strategy. One of the things we lose with backlogs in that, because we can't see the wood for the trees, it's very difficult to tell whether fixing this bug will advance us on the company strategy and the company goals. It's very difficult to tell if a feature request is strategic or not. They're just stuff to do. And if you say it's not strategic, somebody else will say it is strategic. But if we have a goal, our goals, it's easier to see our bigger goals with our strategy, with our purpose, with our missions, and then we can drive our work from our goals. So I'm moving towards calling this objective-driven Agile, or ODA, or rather I'm starting to use these words. I like to think of Agile happening on a super cycle, whether that be 2 months or 4 months or whatever, I don't really mind, but we have these super cycles. And at the start of the super cycle, we're setting our goals, we're ignoring what's happened in the past. We are saying, we will do the work to advance us on these goals. And I intend to write more about objective-driven Agile and ODA later on. Just haven't got around to it yet. Back to backlogs. I think backlogs are what psychologists call transient objects, or you probably recognize as comfort blankets. These are some comfort blankets or the cuddly toys from my house and my family. These are things children have, whether it's the pet koala or an actual comfort blanket or the baby otter. As children start to become their own people, children need these items. Children hug these items. They're substitute for mummy and daddy when mummy and daddy aren't there. They're there in the night. Some children carry on with them till they're several years old. Most of them move away from them. It's what psychologists call transient object. They are an object that helps you grow up. They are an object that helps you understand the world and gives you some comfort. And frankly, this is what I think backlogs are. Backlogs have allowed us to transition from the pre-Agile big requirements documents. Every T was crossed and every I dotted, and we understood it in minute detail. That big requirements document. We kind of, backlogs came along, and backlog allowed us to duplicate those things. But really, it's time to move beyond backlogs. We need to let those childish things go. We need to say, what are our objectives for the coming period? And let's have the confidence to work towards those objectives directly. We're not short of ideas. We're not short of people to ask. We will find the work to do. So let go of childish things. Now, I know when we're on to questions, the question that always comes up is, will you really nuke your backlog? Is this too drastic? And as much as I would like to, I can see why it's difficult to do that. I can see why, you know, walking into your legacy bank and saying we're not going to have no backlog anymore is probably going to upset some people. So I think there are gentle transitions you can make here. You can try to talk about goals and outcomes as stakeholders. You can try and raise a level of conversation away from backlog items and user stories and talk about the bigger things they want to achieve. You can raise the level of conversation. You can then start to think about setting quarterly objectives, outcomes, things that the team should be working on. And once you've got that, you can start to put those objectives in the front. You can put the backlog in the back seat. You don't need to, you can draw on the backlog if you need it. If there's something useful in there, by all means do it. You can remember it's there, but you don't put the backlog in the driving seat. The backlog takes the back seat. You drive with the objectives. And slowly, over time, as you celebrate your goal, celebrate meeting your goals, your backlog will fade into history. And this is kind of how I did it a few years ago. The organization I was working with had adopted OKRs, and we quickly realized that the OKRs and the backlog were a potential conflict. And we just decided that we would lead with the goals from the OKRs, and with a backlog, we'd play a supporting role, but we weren't going to chase after the backlog. You know, an item was there, sure, we'd pull it in, we'd do it if it contributed to the goals. If we didn't have an item in the backlog, we'd just write it out and do it. And slowly the backlog fades into history. Oh, there we go. Come to the end there. I think we're in some breakout groups. So I'm going to take a drink. Thank you. So, okay. Hopefully the editors can cut off that bit from the video before it goes public.